Amarillo. I am Skylar Gallup, and you're listening to Hey Amarillo, the interview podcast featuring some of the most interesting people and stories of Amarillo, Texas. We record every week at Amarillo College's Innovation Outpost. The IO supports education, workforce development, and industry growth by inspiring and facilitating innovation in the Texas Panhandle. Today's guest on the podcast is Doug Loomis. Doug just retired from a 39-year career in Amarillo ISD, most recently serving as superintendent of the district for the last 6 years. When I think about perspectives of our community, it's hard to think of a sharper or keener one of them than from a person who's led our main school district through everything we have experienced over the last 6 years. Now, I already had great respect for Doug, but listening to his retelling of challenges, decision-making, and what it's like to hang that hat up reminds me of the caliber of people that we get to call our neighbors. Here's Doug. All right, Doug Loomis, welcome to the Hey Amarillo podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll dive in. Doug, you and I have worked together for a good couple of years now, and so really familiar with your body of work and the approach. And of course, you know I have a great amount of respect for you, and so excited to talk to you today.
Well, thanks. It's my privilege to be here.
Yes, sir. Okay, the first thing, though, I like to ask all of our guests is, how did you come to be here today? So what is sort of your origin story with this place that we call home?
You know, I'm a Panhandle boy. I grew up in Dalhart, and I've lived here my entire life. Almost 39 years ago to the day, I moved to Amarillo as a classroom teacher. And so I've spent 39 years in Amarillo in the education system, supporting our kids and community, and it has been a wonderful ride. 39
years in education. The first thing I think about is how much has changed over 39 years. And you began as a classroom teacher, you just retired as superintendent of Amarillo ISD, and so worked the full gamut of positions within education. When you look back, I guess my first question, which was your favorite?
Oh, wow. I think I've told everybody that it was either being the associate principal at Paladura High School, or maybe it was being that PE teacher at Wolfland Elementary. It's a toss-up for those two positions.
And what did you start as? What classroom? What grade?
I was an elementary PE teacher at Wolfland Elementary, and it was a wonderful 2.5 years that I was at Wolfland. When we went to the middle school concept, which was in the late 80s, early 90s, I transitioned to Bonham Middle School, where I taught science, and from Bonham went to Fannin as a science teacher and had my first taste of being an administrator. And then I was an assistant principal at Sam Houston, and then went to Paladura as the associate, and then was at Mann as principal. And then what most people remember me as principal at Amarillo High was there 10 years, and then transitioned to the support center as a executive director of student performance, and then the HR director. 5 years of my life that I will never get back there. I don't wish HR on anyone. And then the last 6 years as superintendent.
So you liked being a PE teacher more than superintendent. That doesn't actually surprise me, Doug.
Yeah, I tell people would look at me all the time and say, how do you put up with today's kids? And I was always quick to say, it's not the kids. You expect the kids to behave certain ways. Matter of fact, I probably behaved that way when I was in school. Probably with people who watched me grow up wonder, how does that guy, have a job, much less lead a district of 30,000 kids? So I tell people all the time, the kids are great. It's the adults who are our pain.
Doug, I think one of the things that I think about a lot when I think about the challenges that our public schools face is the idea that our entire society lives in our public schools. And I think that's kind of in the same vein that you're saying about it's not the kids. It's just that because public schools take all students, they take all of our society, good, bad, and ugly, and that walks in your halls.
Yeah, it does. I'm so proud of it. I used to tell people all the time, I'm not opposed to vouchers. That's been the topic, because I think parents ought to have a choice of where their kids go to school. That's the reason we've had open enrollment in AISD really the last 10 years, and maybe even closer to 20, but really in the last 10 years, truly. And so what I worry about vouchers is that, I'm going to take my kids and I'm going to go be with kids who look like me. And somebody else is going to take their kids and go be with kids who look like them. Yeah. And at some point, how do we all learn to come to the table and work together? And that's really the struggle in public schools. So, in the battle over dollars, how much money do you really need? And my answer was always, if you just want me to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, I'm probably there. But so many of our kids who show up to our classrooms every day have such complexities. Not their fault, not their parents' fault. It is just our society and the complexities that we have. If we're going to tackle those kinds of complexities and those kinds of mental health and societal well-being challenges, it's going to take a lot. And I think that's where we get off kilter sometimes. And the public will look at you and say, well, you're teaching my kids things I don't want you to teach them. And I absolutely understand that and respect that. The problem is we've got kids from all walks of life walking through the door, and you've got to find a way to get them ready and able and willing to learn math, to learn numeracy, to be literate. And that takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of resources, makes being a classroom teacher very, very challenging. If their job was just about teaching, reading and writing and arithmetic, it wouldn't be an easy job, but they have the skill and the talents to do with that, to deal with that. What they don't necessarily always have are for those kids who come in and have control issues and who are struggling with emotional issues and behavioral issues, and that just opens up in a classroom, and teachers and classroom and campus administrators have to deal with that, and that's a very, very tough and challenging job.
Yeah, I think sometimes we forget that a student can't learn reading, writing, and arithmetic if they don't have those lower tiers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs checked. And because of many of the reasons that you've enumerated and many more, many of our kiddos aren't coming to school with those basic tiers to where their brain can learn fifth grade math, which is surprisingly challenging.
Yeah. Almost 80% of our kids are coming from low socioeconomic homes that walk through our doors, and well over 50% of our kids are at risk. When you just look at those two broad categories, you start to recognize all the kids who walk through the door, they don't look alike, walk alike, and talk alike, and they're all at different levels. And that's one of the things that makes us special because of the diversity, and we learn to work with one another, to respect one another, to challenge one another, and and unfortunately some days fight with one another. I think that's what happens. That's what happens in families, but that happens in schools, and we have that conflict and those celebrations and those joys, and it just takes a lot for us to be able to manage that. Out of Austin, there's been a lot of talk about parental bill of rights, and as I talked with our legislative group, I said, parents ought to have rights. Parents ought to be involved. There shouldn't be something sneaky that happens. There shouldn't be something we're doing behind, the curtain, as it would be. If you're going to have rights, there also comes responsibilities, and this really has to be a teamwork. This is a three-legged stool, and the kiddo's sitting right in the middle of it, and the school has part of the responsibility, the parents has part of the responsibility, and I would advocate that our community has part of that responsibility.
Yeah. Doug, I know that you led the district through some really incredible cultural and societal occurrences. The first one that comes to mind, of course, is the pandemic. You were the leader of how many kids in AISD?
Somewhere between 30 and 35,000 kids.
Kids and families.
Yeah, families on top of that.
Yeah, the majority of our community, in fact. And you were at the helm of leading through unprecedented times and making decisions that, I know I wouldn't want to have to make. But even in addition to that, just in the last year, you guys went through the process, the very, very difficult and upsetting process of having to announce some school closures. And I think, from my perspective, you've led with honesty and compassion is, I think, one of the things that I would say I've always seen in the way that you've communicated with your community. You're retired now. Those are not decisions that you'll have to make again. When you look back on your leadership, I guess my question is, what did you learn maybe about yourself, about our community, about going through hard times, from the vast majority of our listenership does not have that level of decision-making burden.
When you aspire to be the leader, and whether it was the classroom or whether it was a campus or ultimately was the district, each time you step up that ladder, there's more weight that sits on your shoulders. And I don't think you expect that. One of the first questions you asked me, what was your favorite job? Well, teaching PE probably was my favorite, but the associate principal at Palo Duro was one of my favorite because I didn't carry all the weight. I got to make many decisions and had lots of power, but ultimately at night when I laid my head down, it really wasn't my responsibility. It was still Stan Chapman's responsibility. And so that made that an easy job. Not an easier, but made it easier. And as superintendent, every day I woke up with a prayer to God, please don't let today be one of those days, God. Meaning, we live in a world where violence is prevalent, and almost not a week goes by that you don't hear about a mass shooting, and too often those are in schools.
Yeah.
And so you carry that weight, and I remember shortly after they announced Deidre, it was a Friday morning, and I pulled up in my parking spot at the support center, and I thought, I only have 5 more days. If I can just make it 5 more days, that didn't happen on my watch. And really, as leader, you always start really with, as you alluded to, that Maslow's, if kids don't feel safe, if parents don't feel safe, nobody's going to learn today. And so you carry that weight and you worry about that in every detail. And I'm really proud of where we came from safety. There was a time probably early in my administrative career when things would happen, we worked really hard to keep that under the cloak of darkness. We didn't share it with anyone.
Yeah.
And by the time we finished in last spring, it didn't matter what happened in our schools. We were creating that kind of transparency. And I think that's one of the things I learned, as a leader, this has to be a partnership. This can't be about, the schools of Chicago in the 1950s when they unplugged all the phones and chained all the doors and told the community to mind their own business. This really is a world that we live in transparency. And so that was one. The other, I recognize maybe because of board members like Dick Ford and Don Powell and some of those guys that would wear me out, I always hated it when one of them would look at me and say, well, you're one of those insiders, and I want you to have an outsider's view. I just learned pretty quickly that people who are in leadership positions, and especially maybe in bureaucracies, government agencies, you start to create this mentality that no's always your answer. And it became pretty clear that was just driving a wedge between everyone, with your parents and our community, because we were always just saying no because we could say no. And so we really tried to flip that and find a way to always say yes. And I'm not naive enough to believe that you're always going to have to say no at some point. But when we say no, we have a really strong reason for saying no. And I think we learned that maybe through the pandemic. There were so many fears and there were so many mandates, and you always had 2 sides of the road, whether it was, yes, we're going to wear masks. No, we're not going to wear a mask. Yes, we're going to get vaccines. No, we're not going to get those. And my job was to lead everybody to the table. It wasn't, I could just wake up and decide, well, I don't want to wear a mask. And so I'm going to tell the school district, no, we're not going to wear a mask. I don't want to get a vaccine. And so I'm going to tell everyone, don't go get a vaccine. That might've been my personal belief. But I had many constituents, teachers, students, parents, community members that believed one way or the other, and it was my job to bring us to the table. Tell people all the time, it's not about wins and losses, it's about win-wins. How do we get everybody to the table and listen to one another and find a way to make this work for all of us? And we had some bumps and we had some bruises, and it didn't always work. But, as you stop and you look back, I think we did a pretty good job in all of those incidents, whether it's about the pandemic or whether it's about new curriculum or whether it's about the darkest days of coming to the rationalization that in a school district that has less than 30,000 kids now, that's probably headed to 25,000 kids, you can't continue to run 50 plus schools. There's just not without significant increases in funding that would not be good stewardship, fiduciaries of taxpayer dollars. And so you have to find a way to bring people to the table and try to help make sure that you're meeting everybody's needs to the best that you can, knowing that you're just breaking people's hearts in some places. And whether it's about, closing a school and somebody makes a decision, well, I'm going to homeschool my kids now, or if it's about a pandemic that we are or we're not wearing masks and they make decisions to go somewhere else. You want to make sure that you've listened to all those voices and you've tried to help everyone have a voice before that decision's made. And I think we got pretty good at reflecting and listening and being transparent and being a team versus this bureaucracy that just ran roughshod over all of its constituents.
Yeah, the idea, like, better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And what I learned really quickly, I didn't know anything, and you'd have a mother, in your office being very passionate on this side, and before the day was out, you had 3 more mothers on the other side of that conversation, and you were trying to figure out how to balance that and not alienate, and at the same time, keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm. The first time you and I sat was 6 years ago, and I know. And you said, and I was trying to learn the public education system because of this new job I was doing. I was really, really green. And I was asking about all these, are we worried about this? Are we worried about that? And you said, Skylar, the thing that we need to be worried about is the demographics in Potter County.
Yeah.
And it was 6 years ago, and I didn't hear anybody else say anything about that for a long time. Yeah. And those demographics are what have resulted in these school closures. Talk to me about why it's difficult on a community to close schools. What are the answers to the demographic changes in Potter County as best you can find them or determine them?
There's no easy answers because it didn't happen overnight. I can remember being, 10 years old. With my father in a car driving between here and Canyon, going somewhere, probably to a WT football game or something. and I can remember being that young and him looking at me saying, someday you won't be able to see the difference between Amarillo and Canyon. They're going to grow together. And that's really what happens in America. We sprawl. When we decide we want something new, instead of rebuilding where we are, we just sprawl and we keep moving. And for whatever reason, after we started, the center of city being where we really are right now on Polk Street, and growing up around the center city, we started to sprawl south. And nobody really recognized that was happening. And just, overnight, we woke up at some point and recognized there's very little new construction happening in the centralized portion of Potter County. On the western edges of Potter County, we've got a little bit of development that has happened over the years, but generally in the center of the city, from I-40 to Amarillo Boulevard, there's just not been a lot of rebirth, as it were, and new growth.
Both in construction and population.
Yeah,
rebirth,
both in
right?
Construction and population, absolutely. I think we started seeing it, my team and I, because we spent so much of our career in North Amarillo. When you started driving east on Amarillo Boulevard and you thought, where did that restaurant go? Where did that store go? And you started recognizing that we were losing mainstay businesses. And not long after that, you started wondering, where have the kids gone? And really, it is about, they're just, as kids would graduate and move off, there weren't new families moving into that part of the town and revitalizing that part of town. And that became very apparent. I've told many of the civic groups that we've had conversations, one of my greatest fears is 10 years or 15 years from now, we're going to be driving up and down I-40. And when you look to the north, that's going to become very urbanized, high poverty, and not a lot of growth. And then when you look south, that's where Amarillo has grown. As I thought about this podcast this morning, what are my hopes for Amarillo in 10 years? About 2 weeks ago, there was an article in the Dallas Morning News about South Dallas, it was a group of leaders that were having a meeting and talking about how do we revitalize, how do we change the perspective of what people think about South Dallas. Their mantra was sort of, it's time to get rid of all of those old preconceived notions and invest in this area. And as I read that article, I sent a couple of our board members, a couple of the staff members that used to work for me, and said, this is what I hope happens in Amarillo. I hope a group of leaders who have the power and the financial and the relationships can find a way to take a look at what is happening really from north of I-40 to Amarillo Boulevard and even further north across the district and across the city, and ask ourselves, what do we want left in Amarillo in 10 and 20 years? Because if we don't find a way to reinvest, to re-envision, really we're just going to keep sprawling to the south, and we're just going to leave behind what's happening in North Amarillo. And I'm fearful that, at some point, somewhere down the road, that becomes almost ghost town, because we've done what we do as Americans very well. We've sprawled. And I hope that we have some leadership that will step up and have some conversations about, how do you rebuild? How do you reinvest? How do you have vision? And I think the same thing could be said about our schools. I'm reminded almost daily that the generations that came before us in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they had a vision of what Amarillo could be. And during that time, they built, 30 to 40 schools, and they were committed to neighborhood schools.
Yeah.
I'm so proud of neighborhood schools. It's one of the things that makes Amarillo special.
Yeah.
And I don't ever want to walk away from neighborhood schools, but our schools also weren't built for, under 200. When you start having schools that become that small, it's hard to have classroom activities. It's hard on the classroom teachers. It's hard on the kids. You start to lose programs. It puts a tremendous amount of burden. A couple of our campuses this year, instead of just having to teach second graders, I taught second graders and fifth graders. And that is, we don't live in a one-room schoolhouse kind of mentality anymore. Matter of fact, I tried to convince myself that I could tell the board that we could run some of our really, really small schools as one-room schoolhouses, not truly one-room schoolhouses, but using that model.
Yeah.
And the longer you talk to staff, you realize the kind of pressure it puts on them, the amount of resources that they no longer have in that model. And ultimately, it starts to affect kids because of the stress on the staff and for the programs that are lost. And so we have to, as a community, make a decision. Do we want Amarillo to be, a community that is split between Randall and Potter County and growing between in the two counties,
rich and poor,
and that's where it is today?
That's right.
Or do we want to re-envision what could be in Potter County and start to revitalize? It won't happen overnight. Schools, in a perfect world, we would take, 2 or 3 of our neighborhood schools and build a new state-of-the-art school that, that would house, research tells us a school is just about the right size, somewhere between 700 and 900 kids. And so because of the opportunities that you have, of the staffing patterns, the efficiencies that you get out of it, and rebuild that state-of-the-art campus. Matter of fact, as we were going down this road, we had the architects help us put together a model state-of-the-art school, what it might look like if we took a sort of a triangle of 3 campuses anywhere in the city and rebuild. And it sends goosebumps, what you could do for kids. But as a taxpayer, I'm cognizant of my taxes and don't want taxes going up. And so that one school, one elementary school in today's economy is probably a minimum of $70 million. And it may be closer to $100 million, depending on what amenities that you put into that building. Is it just a K-5 building, or is it a birth to 5 building? Because what we know is that if we want our kids to be successful, they need to come to school ready. And so, if you could re-envision that, I would articulate, you don't build schools for pre-K-5, you build them from birth to 5 and give those kinds of supports.
But, to your point, you've got to have the funding for it. I think it's interesting. You talked about, revitalizing neighborhoods and re-envisioning the way that we look at our schools. And I think, as per usual, our schools are left holding the bag for a lot of things that are not their making, nor actually a responsibility. And I think in Amarillo, we're in a really interesting time because we've had a lot of high leadership turnover. There are a lot of new leaders in our community. What do you think that it would take? My thought when you said, we love our neighborhood schools. Well, if we love our neighborhood schools, that means that we need to also love our neighborhoods and create or revitalize neighborhoods that allow people to stay in them, that make those kiddos that graduate from those schools come back and buy the house next door and put their kids. And so at this kind of time where there is a lot of change, what do you think our community and its leaders would need to do to try to take on this issue that has been decades in the making?
I don't know that I have the answer. But what I know is it can't happen in isolation. The superintendent can't sit around and bemoan about this issue. Developers can't do it alone. The mayor can't do it alone. There really needs to be a task force and a group of leaders that step up and talk about these are the steps and these are the long-term things that we're going to do, and make a commitment to that revitalization. And I'm not naive. I understand if I'm a developer and there's no money in building, a new neighborhood in a certain section of town, I get why they're hesitant to put those millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars to work. But if we're in this together and we make commitments together and figure out a way, as the superintendent, it felt like at a point we woke up and I started driving and businesses were gone. We woke up and houses were empty. They were neglected. There weren't, in the houses that did have people in it, didn't have families in them. So there were fewer and fewer kids. I just woke up and thought, how do we get to this point? We're still here, but the businesses are gone, the families are gone, and we've got to find a way for schools to stay. We've got to find a way for businesses to come back. We've got to find a way to entice families to think, I can make a long-term commitment in this neighborhood. And the truth is, most families aren't going to make a commitment in a neighborhood that is run down, that is poverty-stricken and really can't see the future. My son is, he's 28 years old and lives in Charlotte, and he bought a townhome in a section of town that is a little bit questionable from a dad that didn't really know, but he's in finance. And he looked at me and he said, there's plans, there's a vision. And this is the next section of Charlotte that is just going to grow and expand. And this is going to be a great place to live in 5 years. I wish somebody in Amarillo could tell me that about, the Park Hills neighborhood, the Pleasant Valley neighborhood, or a myriad of other places. Those just happen to be the first. There's going to be schools, across the spectrum in the district, not just in North, not just in East, but in South and in West, that at some point in the very near future, if something doesn't change, there's going to be conversations about how do we merge these two neighborhood schools. They'll still be neighborhood schools, but instead of just being a few blocks from the school, they may be a mile or so from the school. The studies that we've done, Amarillo has, to our comparison school districts, we have 20 more schools than our comparison school districts.
Yeah.
And when you think about schools are funded with equal dollars, it's not quite that simple, but the dollars we get is the same dollars somebody else gets. And we're operating 20 more schools than school districts who look just like us on the exact same dollar. We're going to have to find a way to manage that in the coming months, years, and decades, or we're just going to continually see this closing of schools and walking away from neighborhoods, and that's not who we are as Amarillans.
It's very painful for a community.
It is very painful.
Yeah. Well, I know you've been sounding that alarm for a long time, and I very much hope that new opportunity and new leadership, and that we can get away from kind of some of those silos that you've talked about. So, kind of wrapping up, you're retired now. Congratulations.
Thanks.
How does that feel?
I told somebody yesterday, be careful what you ask God for, because he's going to give it to you. And I came to the rationalization, I don't know, about this time last year that, it was probably time for the district to have new leadership. I think that's one of the things I've always recognized in myself, that when you've run your gamut, it's time to step aside and let someone else take over the helm. And I'm excited about what the district has in store for itself under new leadership and where it'll go. For me, I'm just trying to figure out how I don't just ruin my wife's chi. She retired from education when I became superintendent. She decided, I've lived with you as a principal. I've had to endure you as the HR director. I'm not about to go to work every day as you as superintendent. So she's been home by herself for 6 years, and I have really messed that chi up.
Right.
And, we're navigating that, trying to figure out where my place is, and I look forward to what Amarillo has to offer, and hope that I can find a place to help support and help Amarillo in the years to come.
Well, I have no doubt that you will. This episode is sponsored by the Amarillo Art Institute at Arts in the Sunset. If you haven't been, this place is an amazing center for Amarillo's vibrant art scene. They have monthly events, including the First Friday Art Walk, which showcases the artists they have in residence, and these are some incredibly talented people with all sorts of wares and different mediums. They also offer classes for children and adults in things like glass blowing, weaving, and pottery. It's all so cool. Check them out on Facebook. Again, that's Arts in the Sunset. All right, we're back with Doug Loomis. Doug, this is the part of the show we call 8 Straight. So I'm going to ask you 8 questions. You can answer them in as much or as little detail as you'd like. Ready for 8 Straight?
I can hardly wait.
I know you're excited. All right, first one I'm excited about because I'm a foodie. What is your favorite local restaurant?
Wow, that's not even fair to say. I'm a pretty simple guy, and I think my favorite restaurant is Hummers.
It's good food.
It is great food, and it's really not about the food. It really goes back to one of the very first restaurants I can ever remember going to as a high school student without parents. Got to come to Amarillo to the Tri-State Fair and do all of that. That was one of the very first restaurants that we ever went to as young adults. And so for the last 40 years, we've been going to Hummers, and it's kind of nostalgic for us. It's a place to meet and greet and talk and enjoy one another. So probably you can find me there, quite regularly.
Some of those first big kid memories really do stick with you.
They do. They do.
And Hummers, I think a lot of people feel that way about it. It really is a gathering place.
Yeah, it is. It's a gathering place. I even remember it, before it was Hummers, it was Chelsea Street Pub.
Okay.
And so, I go back a few days with that place. And so
That's great. That's
cool place
great.
to be.
Okay, other than wind, what does this area have too much of?
As I think about that question, I think there's two sides of that coin. I think there's a positive side of it, and I think there's a negative side. And,
Sure.
And so I think what we've got, too much, you can never have too much, but I think we have hardworking people. When I think about Amarillo and the people that live in Amarillo, they are just hardworking folks who just show up and get the job done every day. I think if I flip that coin on the other side, I think we have too much of what I might call just trolling, and social media brings that to light. And I just wish that as adults and as kids, we could all remember that just because we read it on social media, because we saw it on social media, doesn't necessarily make it true. And I think we just have too many people who get out there and they get on one side of the debate, and that's where they live and they stay, and they refuse to see the other side of it. And I worry not just about Amarillo, but our nation at large, that we've become too polarized, and it's not okay for me to believe one thing and for you to believe something else, and recognize we can still be friends, and we can still be colleagues, and we can still get along. And I just think there's way too much of that.
It always starts with caring about our kids.
It was never done.
Yeah.
I mean, almost none of what happens is ever done out of malice.
No.
It'll just get twisted. It'll get turned. You don't see it from that point of view.
Right.
And when I was the HR director, I didn't have one, but I had two signs above my desk that said, "No good deed goes unpunished." And that's really, it was just a reminder that the good deed I'm doing for Skylar today may not be such a good deed for someone else, and that will turn on you very quickly.
Yeah.
And so you have a responsibility to think about what are the unintended consequences, what's going to happen. And in this world, you can't predict all that. What you have to be willing to do is to hear people. And when people are upset, when they have concerns, when they bring issues to the table, you just have to be willing to roll your sleeves up and go to work for them and find the winning solution.
Yeah.
I think that's more often than not when you can get people off of social media, out of that trolling mentality, and you can get us at a table across from one another, we can find solutions and we can get better.
Yeah. What does Amarillo not have enough of?
I always come from this from what do the kids need more of?
Yeah.
And I worry about our kids' access to mental health. I'm excited about the new psychiatric hospital that we just broken ground on. But that really is a level 4 kind of service. And when I think about mental health, I really am thinking about that level 1. More mentors, more buddies, more safe spaces for kids to have conversations, that place where kids can learn character and learn what grit and all those things that have made Amarillians proud and withstand the elements of where we live over the years. Our kids need the opportunity to learn those things. And I just, so many places that's absent. And again, we go back to that. Is it really the school's responsibility? The school definitely has a part to play. But again, what I may want my kids to learn, you may not want your kids to learn. And so where do we build that? And again, it goes back, is that parents' responsibility? Absolutely. But parents don't always have the tools either. And so that's when I look at, as a community, what are we doing? There's always got to be more economic opportunities for our kids.
Yeah.
Too many, we talked about both of my kids will never come back to Amarillo, because of opportunity and because of way of life and opportunities in other places. And I think as a community, we need to think about how do we get our best and brightest to stay here and live here. And that's about, the economic opportunities. And it's also as much about, shade and green spaces. Maybe it's not really parks, maybe it's not really trees, but it's what are those things that will get young couples, young adults to say, I want to live in Amarillo. A a large part of that has to do, with our close-knit community and our focus around community, but it also has to do with what is there for me to do in Amarillo? What opportunities are there for my kids? I'm so proud of AISD's MORE campaign. What can we do more than just math and arithmetic? I think we always could use more of that mental health, those economic opportunities, and that shade and green space that
brings people back.
People back.
Yeah, that's a really important note. What is your favorite local neighborhood, Doug?
I'll get in trouble if I answer that question. I have lived in the Western Plateau neighborhood for 32 years, and so it's got to be one of my favorite places. Gisela and I, we bought our first home there, and we still live in that first home. And I love the neighborhood. It's working class people who love their kids and love their neighborhood and still get out and ride bikes and take care of stray animals, and it's a great place to live. But I can move from there. When I first moved to Amarillo, and I was in awe of the Wolfland neighborhood,
Sure.
of all the big homes and the magic, the mystique. When I was assistant principal at Sam Houston, I loved being in the San Jacinto neighborhood, getting to know those folks and getting to understand, the challenges that they have and working with them. And so Giselle used to tell me I changed colors better than anybody she knew. For about the first 10 or 15 years of my career, I wasn't anywhere more than 2.5 years.
Yeah.
And so every 2.5 years, I was going to a new school, putting on new colors, a new mascot, learning to love. Every community has something to offer. Everybody, if you haven't explored Amarillo, haven't gotten out and to know people in all those communities, you're really missing an opportunity.
I agree. How do you describe Amarillo to people outside the area?
We're all crazy.
That might be just you, Doug.
Okay. Yeah, well, definitely. My son and his girlfriend were here over spring break, or it wasn't over, his few days after spring break, but anyway, they left, about 10 hours before we had that horrific windstorm.
Oh my gosh.
And so I tell people all the time, if it wasn't for the wind in Amarillo, it's a perfect place to live. You have 4 seasons.
Yeah.
You have the opportunity to experience everything. But I tell people, people who live in Amarillo have a really quiet strength. They care about people. They show up. And they show up without being asked. I've watched it in schools for almost 40 years. That there are generations of kids that have come through our schools, and there are teachers, there are bus drivers, cafeteria workers, administrators, the gamut, that have cared about people, cared about our kids, and seen their potential long before the kids could see it themselves. And so the people are what makes this place really, really special.
I think we throw that around. I think a lot of people say, "Oh, it's the people. We've got great people," and I think sometimes when you say something too often, it loses its impact.
Yeah.
But I think, anytime I'm talking to a person that works in a school, I think they know that answer at the very depths of their heart, perhaps more, I think only like those frontline workers, teachers, police officers, paramedics, those people that really see what we mean when we throw around, God, the people here are great.
Yeah. I can't hardly remember a time when a kid was in crisis, somebody didn't step up.
Right.
Whether it was a Gilliland Foundation in their clothing van. They've given out millions of dollars worth of clothing over the years to make sure our kids were clothed, whether it was snack pack, and the list runs on and on of people who are committed to making sure that this is a special place.
Yeah.
We may not have mountains and landscape, but the people who live in Amarillo have grit, they have care, and we may not have mountains and skyscrapers, but we do have those sunsets.
Yeah.
We do have those sunsets.
That's not something worth forgetting.
Yep.
So what is the most underrated aspect of living here?
I heard it yesterday. I think it's our schools. We have, you hear people talk about urban school districts that are under siege. And sometimes I worry that Amarillo gets caught up in, the big city schools and the issues that come with those. We really do have a very, very special school district, and that's not just because I've been a part of it. It's because
although it is in part because
I've been privileged enough to be a part of it. People just lose sight of how special our school districts are. When Dr. Perryman was here in February, he was
state demographer,
the state demographer that was here that talked. I was a little bit nervous because we scheduled for him to come, and he and I never really had a conversation about what he was going to talk about. And even the day that we held the conference, I wasn't even real sure he was going to show up. I've been told he was going to show up, and they said he'll fly in and he'll fly out. And
he's a busy guy.
Literally, that's what he did. And to hear a guy that hadn't been prepped from us, hadn't been told what to say the uplifting things about our school district, to be able to recognize that from a 10,000-foot level, and to be able to say the things that he was able to say about our school district, I thought, I know the people in the audience think I put him up to this. And I had no idea he was going to say those kinds of things. And it really is a special place.
I agree. When was the last time you wore cowboy boots?
Are you wearing cowboy boots? Yeah, you're surprised I'm not wearing them this morning.
I thought you normally do. I've seen you in them.
I told somebody, where'd I go? Went somewhere, had to go to a board meeting last Monday night. And I looked at him and said, I want you to understand, this is the first time in about 3 months I put on a pair of pants. And I just put on pants for you. So it's been a month or two since I put on my boots, but my wife will tell you, I will put my cowboy boots on and wear them. My heritage of growing up in Dalhart, in cattle and ranching and farming, the family farm, it's still very much in my heart, even though hadn't been on a horse or been on a tractor in a really, really long time.
Well, it's a beautiful part of all of our heritages, whether or not I think we put on a pair of cowboy boots. You know what I mean?
Yep, it is.
I think it kind of lives in the lifeblood of this area.
It does.
Yeah. So similarly, when was the last time you visited the Big Texan?
As I mentioned, my son and his girlfriend was here, and one of the things she had heard about is that 72-ounce steak. And so we went out and spent a couple of hours out at the Big Texan. The Lee family, they have put Amarillo on the map, and we need to be grateful, and we all as Amarillans need to spend more time out at the Big Texan. We spent some time with their microbrew that day, and the Lee family has me hooked on some of their brew that they've got out there, and so everybody needs to go out and try it if they haven't been out there.
Wonderful, and super valid to tip your hat to that family that really has done so much.
They are. When you think about leadership, they have never forgotten who Amarillo is. They've never walked away from Amarillo. They have vision, they have dreams, and they just continue to grow Amarillo and put us on the map. And we owe a lot to the Lee family.
Lovely. Okay, finally, that concludes 8 Straight, but I like to wrap things up by asking what you would like to endorse. So an opportunity to recommend anything at all related to the area. Could be an activity, a neighborhood, a nonprofit. What's a wonderful local thing you want other people to know about?
Maybe my last time, Skylar, to be able to do this, and I want to put a shameless plug in for Amarillo Independent School District. I just think the people that are there, the kids, the families, it really is remarkable. I would encourage all of our listeners that if you've not been to our stories page and spent some time listening and watching the stories about the folks who walk the halls and interact with our best and our brightest, I'd encourage everyone. Go to that webpage and look at our stories and see the commitment of the folks who educate our kids. I was honored at LifeWise earlier this week because we've found a way to open the doors for Bible study to happen during the school day without crossing that church and state threshold. And I looked at all of them and said, I don't know when educators started to become the bad guys in the community. I said, but I want everybody to remember, you live next door to teachers and to educators. You go to the store with them. You go to the church with them. They're your friends. They're the people you go on vacation with. Those are the same people that are in our halls. And we've got really, really good people in our halls. Again, we may not always all think and walk and talk alike, but we need to give some grace and humility. As I will get angry and push, I'm always reminded of those cheesy bracelets we used to wear. What would Jesus do? And I'm just reminded that, in a world where we all talk about that we're Christians and our faith, I worry that we don't always walk in that faith, and we don't always do what Jesus would have done. He wasn't in the palace. He was at the feet of people, washing their feet. And we as a community need to be thankful. We live in the greatest nation in the world. We live in a great state, in a great community. As we were coming in this morning, listening to the wars that are going on and the plight, and we need to be thankful for what we have and who we are, and we need to support one another, love one another. And as my wife will tell me, you talk a lot about grace and being humble, and she reminds me, and you need to have a little more grace, and you need to be a little more humble. And so, it's not that I'm preaching to people. I guess I'm really preaching to myself. I want to be more like Jesus. I want to have grace. I want to be humble. And that's what I want for our community.
Yeah. Well, Doug, you are hanging your hat on an incredible career. I think that generations of families in our community will look back at your leadership and your tough decisions and your love for our kids and their families in our community, and have a lot of appreciation for the work you've done. So I want to thank you for that, and best of luck in your retirement. Give Giselle some space. You've rocked her boat a little bit.
If I don't, I may have to go find a new place to live.
See if one of your kids will take you in. Doug, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Skylar. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. If you're starting or growing a small business and need some cash, let me tell you about Amarillo Venture Capital. They are a Hey Amarillo sponsor. They're locally owned, and what makes them different is they don't just invest in businesses. They invest in people. So whether you need $5,000 or $50,000, they offer flexible, asset-based loans, often with funding in a week or less. And it's not just the money. They can connect you with their local network of legal, accounting, and business resources to truly help you succeed. Check them out at AmarilloVentureCapital.com. That concludes this episode. Thanks so much to Doug Loomis for the interview, and to Amarillo Art Institution's Arts in the Sunset and Amarillo Venture Capital for supporting this podcast, and to Angelina Marie for editing every week. Executive directors on this episode are Barbara and Jim Witten. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, you can contact us at heyamarillo.com. Thanks for listening. This has been episode 403 of Hey Amarillo. My name's Skylar Gallup, and we'll see you next week.